Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I am the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa History page of YouTube in just a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague, Andrew Klump, is watching that feature and prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions before we end today. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Sara Huyser. Sara Huyser is a librarian at Northwestern College and serves as the treasurer of the Dutch American Heritage Museum in Orange City, Iowa. She holds a master's degree in American history with a focus on museum studies from the University of Iowa. Professional experience includes work at the University of Iowa's Medical Museum and the historical collections at the Claude Moore Medical Library at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. In 2022, she completed the Master of Library and Information Science with a concentration in archival studies from Emporia State University. And now I'm happy to turn over to Sara to begin the webinar.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me this morning to present on our own local Prohibition story, but I'm just going to add a little bit more detail about my personal background. I moved to Orange City, Iowa when I was only 4 months old, so I really had no choice in the matter. I graduated from high school, attended Central College, married my husband. We went to graduate school, and then he decided to become a lawyer for the United States Air Force. And we moved up all around the United States of America. And then in 2013, we moved back to my hometown of Orange City, Iowa. This time it was by my choice. And I started working at DeWitt Library in 2015. And I really love my job here at the college. I work in an absolutely beautiful library, and I'm really blessed to have a lot of delightful colleagues that I work with. My non-paying job is my volunteer work at the Dutch American Heritage Museum, and I've been a volunteer there for about 12 years. And it is there at the museum that I was shown these whiskey bottles with notes tied around them. Well, I have found that people who like local history tend to be naturally nosy. And so I immediately had to do some sleuthing to figure out their origin. And that's when I learned about this exciting bootlegging story that included a murder in my very own community. Now, to me, this story is really a dark comedy, kind of in the vein of a Joel and Ethan Coen movie. Many years ago, they did this movie called Fargo. It is really dark. There are bloody deaths, but then there's this inept bumbling of the criminals and actually of some jailers, which kind of adds to this comedic effect. Our story, Bullets, Booze, and the Noose, an Iowa Prohibition story, first takes place in Sioux County, Iowa in 1919, for that is where the murder occurred. And then in 1921, the murderer, Ira Pavey, was tried in the Sioux County the Sioux County Courthouse in Orange City, Iowa. I like to joke that before the O.J. Simpson trial, there was the trial of the century right here in Orange City, Iowa. It was a pretty big deal for our little town, and it garnered a lot of attention in the Midwest. So for those of you who are listening today and are not familiar with Orange City, it is located in the northwestern part of the state. It was founded in 1870 by Pella Dutch, looking to take advantage of the Homestead Act and to start a new colony up here. Now, these Dutch Americans were extremely religious folk, and I do believe that Orange City probably still has that statewide reputation today. So it might be a bit of a surprise to you to learn that there is this exciting bootlegging story in the history of this religiously conservative community. You know, Orange City did have its fair share of moonshiners. The museum received this donation of a still that was dug up in a farmer's grove in Alton, Iowa. And of course, Sioux County's rich corn was a great key ingredient for the manufacture of alcohol. And the college archives has cassette tapes of a cemetery tour given by an older resident. His name was Nelson DeYoung way back in 1983. And he claims that these types of cemetery stones were perfect for storing illegal booze. Because the stone is hollow, this plate can be unscrewed and then it could be whiskey could be stored in it. This stone was laid in 1886 for a Hendrik Topasky, which is a little bit ironic because he is the father of one of the lawyers who prosecuted the murderers in our story. But I do need to clarify and proclaim the innocence of my hometown because none of the bootleggers nor the murderers were from Orange City, Iowa, or even Sioux County, Iowa. Instead, the story revolves around the true escapades of the Red Burzette gang, which operated out of Sioux City, Iowa, which today is just a simple 45 minutes south of Orange City. Now, an article featured in the November 1919, the Police Journal, claimed that the Burzette gang has a record which, when entirely uncovered, will equal that of the James brothers. Well, might not be exactly true because most of us have heard of Jesse and Frank James. In fact, Jesse James actually visited Orange City and stayed a night at one of our local farmers' homes. But their stuff of their robbery of the banks and stagecoaches and trains, that is the stuff of legends. But this motley group of outlaws really did not become legend, this Red Burzette gang. They kind of have faded into the historical past. But as I have spent some time researching this band of criminals, the Burzette gang was really quite filled with bad characters. They committed robberies. They transported and sold illegal booze. They committed auto theft, and they also committed a lot of murders. In fact, in the late 1910s and early 1920s, headlines in Iowa were filled with the Burzette gang's crime sprees. Journalists wrote about their reign of terror. Now, one murder that the Burzette gang committed happened at Perkins Corners in Sioux County in 1919. And this led to the much anticipated trial in the Sioux County courthouse. This crime involved murder by bullets, theft of illegal booze, and ended with one outlaw being hung by the noose. To understand this story, I will begin today by talking about the gang leader. His name was Donald A. Burzette, but newspapers rarely used his first name. Instead, they used his nicknames of Torchy and Red, which clearly was because he had a shock of bright red hair. Sometimes he went by Howard DeFrance. He stood about 5'10". He was 180 pounds. He had a strong athletic figure, and he was born and raised in Clear Lake, Iowa. When he was younger, he was bright, quick mentally, and was a boy of fine appearance. In the 1910 census, when Donald was only 15 years old, he was listed as a sewer worker as his occupation. In December 13, 1910, he married. While he was probably only 16, the marriage certificate listed him as 18. And the same with his new wife, Grace Gilbert. She was listed as 16, but was actually only 13 or 14. And the paper announced that they had a baby boy 4 months later. I don't think this child lived. And another child was born, a girl this time in 1913. So perhaps a life of crime was more appealing than working in the sewers and taking care of his family. Now, even as a youngster, Donald was prone to a life of crime, and he made the newspapers a lot. These news stories about Donald are probably something that his mother was not clipping out and sticking to her refrigerator. In 1908, at the age of 14, he stole furs from a store. In 1912, he stole hides from a freight train. He was committed to the industrial school at Eldora for punishment. In 1916, he stole a car. In 1918, he stole more cars, this time in Minnesota. And after a gun battle at a farm, he was thrown in jail with his brother and another accomplice. But the brother, Everett, escaped because they had failed to find the weapon on him and he drew a gun. So Donald lands in this little small jail and he too masters an escape. And I'm going to read the story from the newspaper. It appears that Sheriff Bernard Fisher left Brzett with access to the corridor of the jail and went out for an evening to attend a meeting of the Moose Lodge. Brzett, during the evening, broke one of the supports holding one of the radiators. With his start, he was able to push open a trap door in the ceiling, gain access to the attic of the jail. From the attic, he's reported to have cut with a jackknife through the siding until he was able to break the boards away and get out upon the roof. Climbing over the roof, Brzett jumped down to a porch, and from there he made his way to the ground and he escaped. Well, I think you get the picture of Donald's moral character. In fact, one newspaper even called him a parasite on mankind. By 1914, his poor wife, Grace, put in the newspaper that she was divorcing him and that she would have custody of their daughter. Now, perhaps to escape the lawmen in north central Iowa and south central Minnesota who were after him following this daring escape from jail, Red Brzett ended up in Sioux City. The Brzett gang continued to engage in all kinds of nefarious activities. They had an affinity for stealing Cadillacs and bootlegging and murder. In fact, nearly every man in the gang had been convicted of some legal offense. Red may have murdered 5 or 6 men himself. Ira Pavey was in Red's gang. At 5'10", papers described him as tall. He was stocky, had a mess of dark hair, and he had blue eyes. He got his nickname Hard Boiled because he never flinched, never showed emotion, and never cracked under pressure. Perhaps some of the appeal of these gangster prohibition stories is based on their clever use of names, but Pavey, growing up in near the Kansas City, Missouri area, he was a miscreant from a young age, and by the age of 15 was put into the Missouri Training School for Boys located in Boone, Iowa, or Boone, Missouri, my bad. This reformatory school opened in 1887 to reform delinquent youth aged 10 to 17. Ira Pavey was not one of their success stories. Pavey had served numerous stints behind bars for burglary, larceny to escape, and even attempted murder. In fact, while he was serving a sentence in Fort Leavenworth Federal Prison, he and a fellow inmate decided to leap to freedom over a 40-foot wall. As one might expect, the two men sustained some bodily injuries. Pavey actually fractured his legs. The other desperado broke his back. One newspaper account said that the two were quickly captured, while another said the next day. Actually, Ira was able to go 15 miles with his fractured legs before he was captured. So I guess the matter of death finding quickly is a matter of interpretation. Now, at some point in his storied life, he joined Red's gang and continued his life of crime. And it was Ira, at the age of 31, who would hang for the murdering of the victim in our story. Now, of the three outlaws involved in Lettner's murder, May might be the most intriguing of all. Newspapers indicated that she was raised in a privileged home near Minneapolis. She claimed to be the wife of Red Brzett since 1915. Since Grace, Donald's first wife, had put the notice in the paper that she was divorcing him in 1914, at least Donald wasn't a polygamist. I actually don't think they had a marriage license. I think that they were just in a common law marriage. Now, people back then were quite fascinated by the women in the underworld uh, of crime in the 1920s. I mean, they were really shedding and defying social expectations of what women should be. And there is a host of flapper bandits that people have written about, but none have really delved into the life of May Brzett much. The newspapers really focused on her physical beauty. The Alton Democrat called her a striking brunette with sterling black eyes, although the reporter then went on to state that she had the eyes of a dope fiend. Another headline exclaimed, May's beauty attracts attention of those who pass her on the streets. Papers also said that she was many times more daring than she was beautiful. And it was May who was regarded as the brains of the gang. Now that you know the three main mobsters relevant to our story, but to create a compelling story, we really need to have some challenges and some obstacles for the characters to overcome. And in this case, for our bootleggers, the muddy Midwestern roads were those challenges and obstacles. Today, we have lovely interstate system and paved highways, but imagine if all the roads that people had to traverse on were like our gravel county roads, but maybe worse because they weren't graded or graveled. Traveling by automobile was not easy, and it was comedic fodder for those living in the early 20th century. You could send postcards like this one, who has a pasted felt flag from Rock Valley that says, country roads around here are great. Come take a spin with me. In 1 week, it is Orange City's Tulip Festival, so it seems appropriate to show an entry from our very first Tulip Festival in 1936. And this entry was titled "Help! I Came Over the Sioux County Roads. Get me out of the mud." I think the participants in this entry had a really good time getting this car completely mudded up. There's these big splats of mud on the top of the vehicle. There's these large rubber hip wading boots available for you to use. There's some shovels in the back. And of course, there's big heavy rope to help pull out a vehicle from the mud. Now, this is an actual picture of Sioux County roads. The date of the murder that I am talking about, it was a Saturday, March 28, 1919. Now, I don't know exactly when this picture was taken, but I think it could represent a picture of the roads at that on March 28. We can see that there's some snow. It had been melting. The spring air had probably thawed some of the ground, and this wreaked havoc on the dirt road. And I really like this comment from a 1921 paper talking about how Sioux County roads were so bad that only frogs could cross them. Trust me that road conditions will come up several times in this story. All right, so let's begin. Our three notorious outlaws were from Sioux City, Iowa. Red and May and Ira were driving north on what is now Highway 75. Trotsky, Minnesota, is a little north of Laverne, and it is where bootleggers went to get their stash of booze. They called this highway the Booze Trail. Red and May, they were driving a 7-passenger Buick, and Ira was driving a Dodge Roadster. Now, the dirt roads in Sioux County were especially muddy that day, and right here near Perkins Corners, they were forced to stop and wait while a Ford touring car was being pulled out of a large mud hole by a local farmer, Farmer DeBoer. He was using a team of horses to work to free this incapacitated car, but it was not an easy task. For 2 hours, the gang waited here at this mud hole. Red got out of the Buick and he started to yuck it up with some of the other folks that were gathered, who were also fellow bootleggers. He was cautioned by another gangster that the roads to Trotsky were awful and that he should expect more delays. And what driver loves the thought of a bunch of delays? Another 54 miles on muddy and impassable roads was quite unappealing and very discouraging to think about. By the time the farmer got that car freed from the mud hole and the gang of 3 could drive past, it was later in the evening, after 8 or 9 p.m. Well, there was another bootlegger around that mud hole, and his name was Claude Lettner. I only have a picture of his gravestone, which maybe seems appropriate because he is the murder victim. Claude was raised in Sioux City, Iowa, and he had been married for 17 years. And he and his wife had gone up to Minnesota, to Slayton, Minnesota, to go to a family funeral. Well, while they were up in Minnesota on the way home, they decided to stop by Trotsky, Minnesota to pick up 11 cases of whiskey to transport it back to Sioux City, Iowa. Now, his wife, Mary, who is called Maisie by her family, was so tired of the roads that she decided in Laverne to take the train back to Sioux City. So it was only Claude on that fateful night on Saturday, March 29, 1919, traveling alone back to Sioux City, but he never came home. Because Red and Ira and May, they had this brilliant idea to steal Claude's whiskey instead of going all the way to Trotsky themselves. They determined that May should just sit tight by the side of the road in the Dodge, while Red and Ira turned the big Buick around to chase down Claude. If only I had a picture of the Lettner car, but I don't. I have this picture from 1926. It's an auto used by robbers as they tried to rob a store at Perkins Corners. I don't know what it was about Perkins Corners and mobsters, but our own sheriff and deputy captured them after this great shootout. So we're going to just pretend visually here as I continue to tell the story. In a scene straight out of the movie, Red sped along Claude's vehicle, forcing him off the road. Claude zigged and zagged back and forth for about 100 yards. Meanwhile, Ira took out his gun and started to shoot at the car, and there were bullet holes in the curtains of the car. And let's remember back then that there were no windows or glass on the side of the windows. It was just like plastic. The one of those bullets found its way through Claude's skull behind his ear. The men drug Claude out of the car, removed the contraband, stole about $500 worth of cash, which is now over $9,000. So it was a good chunk of money. And they stole Claude's pistol. They transferred that whiskey into their Buick, left Claude laying for dead in the furrow in the field, and double-backed to pick up May in the Roadster. The bootleggers' destination was to unload the contraband in Wessington, South Dakota. May claimed that from Perkins Corners to Wessington, the outlaws had to drive through the night, through the day, and a little through the night to get to Wessington. Today, that trip would be an easy 3 hours and 20 minutes on paved roads. But in another twist of fate, the roads got the better of them again at Huron, South Dakota, and Ira slid his Dodge directly into the ditch. Being so tired and sick of the roads, this time they decided to abandon the car for a little bit. Ira squeezed into the Buick with May and Red, and they headed on to Wessington. When they arrived in Wessington, the trio checked into a local boarding house. Later, the men went back and retrieved the car. This time, a farmer, Mr. Peter Arteman, and ironically, he too was a Dutchman born in Zeeland, the Netherlands. He helped the Ira and Red to pull out the car. They pulled out this wad of cash. They gave some money to Mr. Arteman, and they also gave him a bottle of whiskey. He would testify later at their trial, and that whiskey bottle was used as evidence. Naturally, it was empty by this time. Now, back in Orange City area, Sioux County, the discovery of Claude's body was causing quite a stir. Dr. DeBay, the coroner from Orange City, was called to examine the body, but he did not get there until noon. That gave a lot of time for people to venture out, and they started coming by the hundreds to view the deceased body laying in the field and to peer into the bloody automobile. This sensational story soon hit the press and was carried around the Midwest. Now, over in South Dakota, those criminals and murderers didn't conceal the crime very well. They sold their whiskey contraband for $550 to Ed Graves. Now, he had brought along a companion with him to Wessington, Mrs. Bertha Lewis. And she and May became friendly, and they took a spin in the Buick, and Mrs. Bertha Lewis noticed that there was some congealed blood in the back of the Buick. And she also spied that there were some spots of blood on those whiskey cases. And then she opened up the newspaper and started to read about the murder of Claude Lettner. And she started to talk about the murder to Red and May and Ira. Well, Ira was none too happy about that, and he pulled Ed out back of the house and told him, "Make that damn woman shut her mouth about the murder." He told her to tell her that they had killed a chicken, and it was the chicken that left the bloody mess. Well, at least 5 people from the Wessington area were called to testify in the trial about whiskey cases covered with blood, blood stains in the back of the Buick, the roll of bills, and a revolver in the gang's possession. But the bootleggers were still at large, and Red went back to Sioux City to continue his life of crime. Now, being a bootlegger gangster on the lam was rather dangerous. Law enforcement was very determined to capture Red, and they were close once, but he was able to escape by swimming across the Floyd River. He didn't remain that lucky, though, for on July 20, 1919, just 4 months after Claude's murder, Red was killed in a shootout with the Sioux City police. You see, early on a Tuesday morning, Red and 2 other ruthless members of his gang, one named Tex and the other was Jim, they drove their vehicle into Mandel's garage, which was on 7th Street in Sioux City. It was only 1 block from the police station. And while they initially purchased a few items and left, they ended up coming back about 15 minutes later, and they proceeded just to remove a tire from an existing vehicle and replaced it their bad tire, and they left without paying. But since the men were heavily armed, the attendant stayed quiet. But one of the gangsters, Tex, he made a blunder. He talked about going to the Car Barn restaurant for some early morning breakfast. And after the trio of thugs left, the attendant rushed to the police department. His father was actually on the force. And very quickly, 2 Sioux City detectives, Jim Britton and Morris Farley, who had been hunting for Red for months, were contacted. Now, the picture on the screen is of the car barn in 1939, 20 years later. A car barn was used to house and maintain streetcars, and it was also a hangout for the men who were operating those streetcars. So at 5:30 a.m. in the morning, our 3 gangsters positioned themselves at the lunch counter nearest the door. Curiously, observers noticed later that they were eating breakfast with their left hands, as the right hand was holding a gun under the table. Suddenly, Detective Britton, followed by Detective Farley, burst into the car barn, ordering the outlaws to throw them up. The bandits immediately responded by whirling their stools around to face the door. Simultaneously, both Britton and Burzett began firing. Then Farley and the other outlaws fired, and the room filled with smoke as bullets flew. Britton and Burzett were hit right away. Both men flinched as wooden pellets plowed through their bodies, but they continued to shoot at each other. Less than 5 feet separated the two men, and eventually both fell. Reportedly, the gun battle only lasted 10 seconds. Burzett was dead. Maynard was hit and fell off the stool. Davis, though still remaining on the stool, he was also shot. And Britton was fatally injured and died later at a Sioux City hospital. At the age of 23, Red's life of crime ended, and he would not stand trial for the murder of Claude Lettner. Meanwhile, Ira Pavey was arrested back in Missouri for concealment of a weapon, and he was imprisoned at Jefferson City, Missouri. When Pavey was done serving his time, the Orange City Sheriff, Sinehorst, traveled down to Jefferson City to pick him up and transport him back to Orange City. Now, prison officials handed Sheriff Sinehorst a note written by Pavey to his friends outlining a plan to help him escape the Orange City jail. The letter requested saws and other tools. And given our apparent success rate in escaping from prisons, this was a real threat. So on March 10, 1921, the trial of Ira Hard-Boiled Pavey began in Orange City, Iowa. Local attorney Garrett Clay was appointed the defense attorney for Pavey. Another local attorney, P.D. Van Oosterhout, was the prosecutor for the state, along with attorneys Ben Gibson, John Fletcher, and Anthony Topaski. The trial garnered a great deal of attention. Pavey was guarded every minute by a detective from Sioux City, Iowa. And according to the Alton Democrat newspaper, the Orange City courtroom was filled with people. They were standing in the aisles, standing in the back side of the room, and they were even sitting in front of the clerk's bench. I guess there were no fire codes back in 1921. Now, Pavey was described as showing no uneasiness. He just sat all day with his head on the back of his hand and his elbow was on the table. May Yetzer Burzett, age 25, was the star witness. She too was closely guarded by the local sheriff. A local reporter described her as well-dressed and appeared at ease on the witness stand, although her eyes shifted rapidly from one thing to another, always avoiding Pavey. She had been indicted for conspiracy and robbery in connection with the cold-blooded killing of Claude Lettner, but was never tried. Witnesses included Dr. DeBay and Farmer DeBoer from Orange City, May Burzett, and the 5 people from Wessington, including Edwin Graves, his companion Bertha Lewis, and the farmer Peter Arteman. I have to imagine that Dutchman Arteman probably really enjoyed his visit to Orange City. Now, Garrett Clay, he was the defendant's attorney. And in his closing arguments, he accused the Sioux City attorney for May Burzett, George Yeaman, of having an interest in having Pavey convicted of Lettner's murder. His conviction would satisfy the public demand and also protect May Burzett. He accused Yeaman of circulating reports of threats against the jury. Finally, Clay threw a little shade onto the Sioux City Police Department. He asserted that the Burzett gang had been protected by the Sioux City Police and declared that they knew who was responsible for the murder 36 hours after it was committed, but did not reveal anything until Brzett met his death in a gun battle with Sioux City police officers. During Clay's closing arguments, Mrs. Mary Lettner, the widow of the murdered man, fainted, and she had to be carried out of the courtroom. The prosecutor, Pavey Van Oosterhout, he took 2 hours to thoroughly reiterate the state's closing argument by reviewing the chain of evidence against Pavey and debunking the idea that evidence was used to frame Pavey. After a 4-day trial and 2 hours of deliberation, the 12 citizens of Sioux County rendered a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. On the first ballot, the jury stood unanimous for first-degree murder, but was divided on the penalty. On the second ballot, the jury stood 7-5 for the death penalty. And on the third ballot, 9-3. And on the fourth ballot, the vote was unanimous for death. Judge William Hutchinson knew that he was going to have to sentence a man to death. And this was not an easy proclamation for Hutchinson to make. Before going back into the courtroom, he asked the bailiff of the court, J.S. Muhlenberg, who was a deeply religious man, to say a prayer for him to have the strength to do his duty. Muhlenberg and Hutchinson knelt while Muhlenberg offered a prayer. Judge William Hutchinson then re-entered the courtroom and pronounced Ira Pavey's sentence to be hung by the neck until dead. The case went to the Supreme Court of Iowa, and finding no error in the trial, the court upheld the verdict. On Friday, September 8, 1922, Ira Pavey, age 31, was hung at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison for the murder of fellow bootlegger Claude Lettner. For his last meal, he was served ice cream and fried chicken. The other 4 men on death row were served the same meal, and Pavey called out to them, "The treat's on me, boys." Meanwhile, his mother, Emma, and his sisters, Fern and Bessie, feverishly drove through the night from Jackson, Missouri. When the Paveys first arrived in Fort Madison late Thursday night, the first large building they saw was the Perfection Tire and Rubber Company. They drove there first, thinking it was the penitentiary, but the night watchman directed them to the right place, and they were able to spend the last 2 hours of Ira's life with them. His mother was bereft with grief. She had tried to get a stay of execution from the governor, but it was denied. Ira had no desire to visit the priest before he died. It was recounted that Pavey gained attention with his pre-execution behavior. Fort Madison prison officials were appalled by his nonchalant attitude as he smoked a cigarette while walking to the gallows. Orange City's sheriff, Seinhorst, had the duty to escort him along with a warden to the gallows. "It's hard, isn't it?" said the sheriff. "It's hard, yes, but it's fair," answered Pavey. Pavey then flicked away his cigarette, mounted the incline, and stood in the exact center of the trapdoor. The warden tied Pavey's arms and legs together with leather straps. "I guess then," said Seinhorst, "we're ready." Onlookers noted that Pavey kept a smile on his face until the hood was pulled over his head. In 16 minutes, Pavey was declared dead. penitentiary officials had planned to bury him a potter's grave, but his mother, Emma, absolutely refused. She took him home to Kansas City for a proper burial. Headlines proclaimed that her mother's love for her hanged boy lasts. Later, Sheriff Seinhorst said he was absolutely certain that Pavey was guilty of this crime. He firmly believed that the law needed to stop crime in Iowa and believed that the death penalty would help. In conclusion, Claude Lettner was murdered with a bullet to the head, Ira Pavey hung by the noose, and it all began because bootleggers met up at a mud hole at Perkins Corner in Sioux County. Both Ira and Red were killed in seeking justice for Claude's murder, but what about May? She actually continued her life of crime. She joined forces with the remaining Bruzette gangs in Sioux City, Iowa. And after this all happened, these men murdered a World War I veteran. They stole money from a rich woman and they stole diamonds. Eventually, all the members of the Bruzette gang were rounded up and thrown in jail. May herself, she remarried a couple of times and lived until 1969. I would like to know more about her. But to finish up, a lot of attention has been given to the outlaws in the story instead of the actual murder victim. I happen to be friends with Claude's great granddaughter, Lori Anderson, and it is interesting to note that the name of Claude lasted for 4 generations. Claude and Maisie had Claude II. Claude and his wife had Claude III. And then that couple also had Claude. The tradition of naming family members Claude now has ended. And that is the conclusion of my story. I can respond now to any questions if you have any.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Sarah. That was very fun. As you know, I have lots of connections in Sioux County, so I love a good Sioux County story. We do have some time here for questions, about 10 minutes. As a reminder, if anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A feature that's here in Zoom. It's going to be down on the bottom bar there for you. Just click it and type in your question. We might not have time to get to all of them, but we've got time. So go ahead and put those in if you have them. Our first question is really a question from me, so the chair's prerogative. But I'm curious, Sarah, if you have thoughts about how this story kind of fell away from public consciousness, because it's very dramatic and there's lots going on, and we all know where Perkins Corner is if we've spent time in Orange City or Sioux County, so we know where it is. But how did this story that was very dramatic about 100 years ago kind of slip away in public consciousness, do you think? I know it's speculative, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess maybe they didn't have the worldwide notoriety of the Frank and Jesse James. The thing is, when I kept doing this research, I'm like, wow, they were really involved in a lot of crime. And I suppose memories are short. I really don't know. The movies didn't get a hold of them. They didn't capture attention in dime store novels, things like that, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But there is quite the story there. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, like to think about. You mentioned Sioux County, the officials being really kind of proud or noting that they brought them to justice, you know, and so there is kind of a community celebration story there that the county and the brought people to justice in a way that Sioux City did not. You know, so not that you'd see it in Tulip Time, but or Tulip Festival, but at the same time, you know, there is that kind of upright community doing the right thing element to this story.
Right. And of course, you know, women in our community were not really the May Burzettes, the queen of the bandit kind of people. We had a really large amount of women involved in the temperance movement.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
In fact, one of the attorneys, Anthony Topaski's wife, was really big in the temperance movement, and she she trained many, many women in how to raise their children, believing in temperance, and she would give
Hmm.
them a Bible after they had their babies and things like that. So um, there is that element to the story. But there were a lot of robberies, and there were a couple big shootouts with our local police. We have another picture in the museum of this car with just like massive bullets in the hole, as holes in the vehicle. And I think, you know, our deputy actually had mounted like Tommy guns on his own vehicle and
Hmm.
shot things up. And it seems so, I don't know, made for the movies kind of story.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. It's been fun. It was a fun one to listen to. We've got another question here, and it's what was written on the notes on the whiskey?
What was written on the notes?
Yeah, on those whiskey bottles.
Sure. Let me, I'm pretty sure I have it written down. I have them on the, oh, well, let me see if I have it on the, they're not overly accurate. And that's the one thing that I was finding when I was doing my research, that they were not overly accurate. So the information on this was not exactly correct. But the first the second whiskey bottle, which was, I had to decipher that, and it said this empty bottle, and I really do love how these bottles were empty, were turned over to J.E. Risden, Iowa State Agent by C.W. Drake on February 24, 1919. That date does not work out because the murder was in March 1919. Mr. Drake said that he bought this whiskey off of Ed Graves the second day after Red Burzett came to Wessington, South Dakota with Ira Pavey and Mrs. Burzett. And the other one, I'm sorry, says this empty bottle was turned over to that same agent, again, kind of a wrong date, at his home. This bottle was full of whiskey and was given to me by Artman, that's a misspelling, by Red Burzett on Saturday night, March 29, 1919, after pulling Red and Pavey out of the mud. And that was Exhibit A. And my understanding is that these whiskey bottles were on display at the Sioux County courthouse, and way before my time at working at the museum, they made their way to our storage unit.
Mm,
Mm-hmm.
terrific. We've got another question, which was Maisie involved in bootlegging along with Claude?
Well, Maisie, not to my knowledge. I mean, she obviously knew about it, because she had stopped with Trotsky to get the whiskey. I think there were people who were involved in bootlegging who just were doing it to make money, and they weren't necessarily these nefarious, horrible human beings. But then there were others that took it to the extreme.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Terrific. Another question here is, how did so many of these things, you mentioned with the whiskey bottles, but how did so many of these other items end up in the museum archives there that you have, or in the Northwestern archives? Do you know how some of these really great pieces that you have on your slides made their way to the collections there in Orange City, especially with where this took place, kind of throughout the region?
Right. Well, I mean, these two whiskey bottles were saved.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, the other things were just given to us, and I was able either. We have a collection of local historians' photographs from his book that he wrote, Siouxland: A History of Sioux County. So I could draw upon that. In our archives, we have just a plethora of different kinds of things, of postcards and stuff like that. And so as I was piecing together this story, tried to draw in things that would help tell the story in a more interesting way. As far as I know, the only two things that we have directly about this case are these whiskey bottles. But of course, everyone's fascinated with the Prohibition era, and people like to share their stories with us. And more and more as we tell people that we have this great archives or we have this museum, we get more and more documents and artifacts to help us understand our local history.
Perfect. Interesting. And just fun to see what you have and how it got there.
Yeah.
Another question, was the booze trail or Highway 75 part of a much larger bootlegging network? So was that kind of line there connected to things that existed throughout the region or nation?
Right, right. That's a really good question. That would be something that I would be far more interested in learning about. Why was Trotsky this place? When I was working on this story, my husband and I drove up to Trotsky, and it's like, 3 blocks wide, and there's no curbs and stuff. How did this part get to be the central location for this distribution of alcohol? And that is something that I really don't know. I would have to do more research and something I would want to learn more about.
It certainly makes sense that it would have been they kind of connected to something, but I don't know that either.
Yeah,
So
I don't either. And it's from Kentucky. This is Kentucky whiskey. So
yeah, so somehow it got there.
rye or anything like that. Yeah.
What can, I know you've mentioned that you're kind of continuing to dig into this story, and so I'm wondering, where are you working? Where are you researching? What questions are you continuing to pursue, or where's your research going next as you keep digging
Well,
here?
I would really love to learn more about May. I found that picture of May on ancestry.com. I know that there's descendants of theirs up in Minneapolis area. I would just like to know what caused her to go that direction, to lead this flapper bandit lifestyle. I also think it would be interesting to know a little bit about law enforcement during this time and the creation of these jails. I just could not believe how many times these people were able to escape from jail. So I think that would be a good area too. And also, like you said, what was the train of movement of this booze throughout Iowa and the Midwest?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think that's great. It's so fun when you're working on such an interesting historical story like this, like to see the threads that you keep pulling, and then you're interested in May. And I love the way you told the story as well, because you can kind of see in the way you craft your narrative the different strings that you've been able to pull and the ones that you're continuing to pick at to try to find out more. Well, we've got time we've got a new question just dropped in. So I'm going to jump to that. How did Sioux County prevent Pavey from escaping, given the plans that were concocted? So escaping from jail, how'd they stop him?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for initially, before the trial happened, instead of taking him all the way to the Orange City jail, they left him in Sioux City jails, where it would be a little bit more secure. But I suspect here they have the detectives, and they had 24/7 kind of watch on him. But it was scary. I think the people in Orange City were, a little scandalized by it all, a little curious about it all, and also maybe a little fearful to have such a notorious criminal in their midst.
Yeah, I can only imagine. We've got time for one last question, and I'll ask, really, this is a question for those who are listening, which is, how would you suggest someone get started in digging and finding stories like this? So you work at Northwestern at a library, you volunteer at a local museum, you found these interesting stories. If somebody wants to get into this kind of storytelling and research, how would you encourage them to get started from your own experience?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm the type of person that love going down rabbit holes. And so, I started just by transcribing the back of this. I knew nothing about this story. And then I was like, oh, Red Rosette. And then, you just start Googling, and then you start by going to ancestry.com, and then you start looking at all different digital newspapers. Thank goodness so many newspapers are digitized, and then you can hunt through them, and then you just keep piecing together more and more and more things, relook at things, look up other people revisit the trial cases are available online. So you just sort of have to be willing to go down a lot of rabbit trails, try to piece things together, and it's a lot of fun.
Mhm.
Doing local history is something that I didn't expect that I would love to do, but now that I'm involved here at the college and at the museum, I really, really have enjoyed learning more about this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the same experience, and so I love hearing from your
Mhm.
perspective how it's not it's a thing that lots of folks can do. You just have to start pulling on those threads or running down those rabbit trails and enjoy
Yes,
the process. Uh,
I like
yes.
that. Enjoy the process. Yeah.
Yes. Well, wonderful. And with that, we're going to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And I want to extend one last thank you to our presenter and my friend, Sara Huyser. It's been a joy. We hope that everyone will sign up for future Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for those webinars in the series or to watch recordings, go to our website, history.iowa.gov. If you're looking to learn more Iowa history, you can find over 90 recorded webinars of past 101 programs on the Iowa History YouTube channel too. We look forward to seeing you at our next special Iowa History 101 webinar, which is on May 25th. And the topic will be the progressive influence of Iowa's churches in the late 20th century. Thanks again for joining us today. Thank you to Sara, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Yep. Bye. Thank you.